someone. Okay, if you give a loan and you're charging interest, then that is a sin. Right? You are taking advantage and exploiting the poor person. So it was banned. Charging interest was banned. Okay? But for business people, of course, they can't survive without charging interest. So how did they get around this policy? Within Spain, they knew that they could not charge interest, so they started lending money outside of Spain. Like, why lend within if you're not going to earn any interest? So lend internationally, okay? And then you justify interest payments, right? When you're lending in foreign currency, then you can kind of say that when we get money back, then it is fair if the purchasing power of what we are getting back is the same as the amount that we lent out to begin with initially. Okay, so that was the origin of PPP. Now, of course, no one believes that PPP holds continuously in the real world, but most economists believe that some version, some variant of PPP is the anchor for the real exchange rate, at least in the long run. Okay, the real exchange rates should be determined by PPP. Okay, and in practice, the PPP exchange rates are often used to determine the degree of misalignment of nominal exchange rates. So when we say that RMB is undervalued or overvalued, then how do we measure the degree of misalignment? It's often based on PPP or some version of PPP. So in a policy context, also PPP extremely important. And in theoretical models, most models would have some kind of PPP built into them, which we will see later, like monetary models and so on. Okay. Now, the large literature on PPP, both academic and policy related, you could just have a full course on just PPP alone, okay? But we don't have that kind of luxury. So here we will look at the underlying building blocks of PPP and some of the literature. We are going to review it. So why should we believe that PPP should hold? Okay, what is the basis for PPP to hold in the real world? So the law of one price is a fundamental building block of the PPP condition. So PPP is talking about the aggregate price level, right, for the country as a whole, right? And each country is producing millions of goods, so it is an aggregate thing that we have in mind. But law of one price applies to a single good. Okay, so that's the difference between law of one price in absolute form, price of good I in terms of the domestic currency at time t, PIT star, price of the same good in terms of the foreign currency, and ST is the nominal exchange rate, number of units of domestic currency per unit of the foreign currency. Okay, so basically law of one price saying the same good or identical goods should have the same price if you express them in the same currency. And why should we believe that? What happens if this equation does not hold? Right? Exactly. So then, yeah, if this condition does not hold, then you have an arbitrage opportunity. Right? You could buy it in this country, this is lower, and then sell it in the foreign country, and you have a riskless profit. If markets are competitive and efficient and the trade costs are not very high, frictionless, okay, then we would expect this equation to hold, at least approximately. So that's absolute version of law of one price. This is the relative version. This is the real exchange rate of the single good. Okay? And so that should be constant over time. That's the relative version. Okay, now law of one price requires that goods produced internationally are perfect substitutes. Right? If they are not perfect substitutes, then their prices need not be equalized. Right? Shoes being produced in China, for example, right? What are some famous brands in China for shoes? Li Ning or something like that? Li Ning, right? Is that the same as Reebok or Nike? Okay, are they perfect substitutes? Right. So questionable, right? It's questionable whether they are perfect substitutes. But we only expect the law of one price to work if they are sufficiently close substitutes. Only then will their prices be equalized. So if they are close substitutes, then no profitable arbitrage would ensure equality of prices in highly integrated markets. Okay? But if there are tariffs, transport costs are large, or there are other non-tariff barriers and duties, then we would not expect law of one price to hold. Okay? So in general, product differentiation across countries can create a wedge between domestic and foreign prices. Okay, so let us suppose that law of one price holds for each individual good, and there are n goods. Okay, now from this, how do we go to PPP, which is talking about the overall price level? So these are individual goods. If law of one price holds for each individual good, then I can aggregate these individual prices into the overall price level. Okay? So the price level of each country is going to be a weighted average of the individual prices. Okay? So suppose that alpha I is the weight of good I in the consumption basket, then alpha I times pi, I sum this up from 1 to n. This is going to give me the domestic price level, P. Okay? And then the same alpha I times the foreign price, I aggregate them. That gives me the foreign price level, P star. Okay? And this is the nominal exchange rate. So if this equation holds for each individual good, then I can aggregate over all these, and then I get the absolute version of PPP for the economies as a whole. Okay? But I'm making an important assumption here. What assumption is that? When we are aggregating these individual prices, what are we assuming over here? We are aggregating these individual n goods to the overall price level in the home country and the foreign country. Well, we can do that. Prices are independent. The weights, alpha I, are the same in the home country and the foreign country. Okay? Is that a realistic assumption to make? No. Okay? If you're thinking of this as the CPI in the US, and this is the CPI in China, okay? The consumption basket in the US and the consumption basket in China, are they the same? No. Okay? And so the weights on the different goods, they are also not going to be the same in general. Okay? In the Chinese consumption basket, the weight on rice may be very high. In the US consumption basket, right, more bread, maybe wheat or whatever. So in general, consumption baskets can be quite different from each other. So here, implicitly, we are assuming that each good has the same weight in the two countries. And that may not be a very realistic assumption. Okay, here we are thinking of the price level as an arithmetic average of the individual price levels. Okay, but price indexes could also be constructed using a geometric average, okay, rather than an arithmetic average. And if they are formed using a geometric index, then this weighted average has to be formed after taking logs. So that's one way of forming the price levels as an arithmetic average. But they could also be formed using a geometric average. And in this case, we have to take log, and then when we take log, so in this case you have to take log before when you're doing the aggregation. So it really depends on what kind of functional form you want to assume for the overall price level. Is it formed as an arithmetic average of the individual prices, or is it formed as a geometric average? The geometric average is used more commonly in the empirical literature, so people work with logs. Okay, so if they are constructed using a geometric, then we must form the weighted sum after taking logs. So it's the same kind of thing, and now, so you get this. Now the weights, alpha or gamma, are based on a national price index, like the CPI, but different indices have been used, like the GDP deflator, the wholesale price index, and so on. Okay. And then we can use these equations to derive the PPP condition. So So earlier we got this as absolute PPP. So if we take logs, okay, so that's your PPP, where the lowercase letters are the logs of the uppercase letters. So now, you can think about testing this, right? So you can think about testing this, and what would you expect? So you construct the log of the nominal exchange rate, and you can construct this, and you would expect them to be cointegrated. And if they are non-stationary, you would expect them to be cointegrated with 1 minus 1. That kind of thing. We will go there soon. Okay, so that's the absolute PPP condition. And you could also define the real exchange rate. Okay, it's just S minus this. You bring this to the left-hand side. That's the log of the real exchange rate, the deviation from PPP. Okay? So if PPP holds, then this should be 0. Okay, now, as we mentioned, deriving PPP from the law of one price introduces a number of index number problems. So for example, we are assuming that the same weights are used to construct the price levels in the home and foreign countries, whereas in reality the weights will typically be different, and they could even be 0 in one country and non-zero in another for some goods. The US basket may have some goods that are absent from the Chinese basket. Chinese basket could have some goods that are absent from the US basket. Okay? That's one problem. The other is also that the weights could also change over time. Okay? Over time, the consumption basket changes. Right? 15 years ago, our expenditure on mobile phones was much smaller. Right now, iPhone 10, more than $1,000 US. Right? There were no $1,000 phones in 15 years ago. So the weights keep changing over time as well. So in practice, what do you do? Well, you hope that approximately, the weights are approximately constant. They're not moving around too much. Okay? So if we were to rewrite this a little bit to allow for different weights, okay, then so here we are assuming the same weights, but suppose the weight is different in the foreign country, it is gamma I star. Then we can rewrite this. Okay, you add and subtract gamma I star, right, to both sides, and then you write the equation like this. So this term, the last term, we basically absorb it in the error term. This last term is caused because the weight, this is the difference in the weights between the home and foreign countries. So if the weights were identical, there would be no error. But because the weights are not identical, that creates an error term between the home and foreign price levels. Okay? But you're hoping that this error term is not too big. It's not too large. Now, under some conditions, Now, in general, we know these error terms are not the same. These weights are not the same. So that creates a deviation, that creates an error. Now, under what conditions will this error not affect PPP too much? So even though the weights are different, PPP may still hold if the shocks are of a particular kind, okay? Even if the weights are not the same, okay? So what kind of shocks will preserve PPP? And if the shocks are mostly monetary shocks, okay, so caused by changes in monetary policy, money supply, then the weights don't have to be identical and we may still get PPP. The reason for that is we know that monetary shocks will change each price by the same percentage in the long run. Okay? So if money supply goes up by 10%, all these goods will go up in price by 10%. Okay? The overall price level is going to be homogeneous of degree 1 in the individual prices. So if money supply goes up by 10%, in the long run, each price should go up by 10%, so the overall price level should also go up by 10%. Okay? And in that case, that increase in the overall price level of 10% can be offset by a change in the nominal exchange rate of 10%. And PPP continues to hold. Okay? So an X% increase in all prices will lead to an X% increase in the foreign price level, and then the right-hand side of this equation will be augmented by that 10%, and that will be offset by the change in the nominal exchange rate. Okay? So what we are saying is that even though there are many index number problems associated with PPP, because of which PPP may fail to hold. But if most of the underlying shocks are monetary in nature, then we may still, there is a better chance of PPP to work. But if the underlying shocks are real shocks, shocks to the supply and demand of individual goods, then these individual prices may not move in the same proportion, okay? And then PPP would fail to hold. Okay, so for example, we're going to do this in more detail later on, okay? So here we are kind of assuming up to now that all the N goods, they are freely traded, right? They can be arbitraged from one country to another. But in practice, some goods and services are non-traded, okay? And we have to account for that, which we're going to look at that later. Okay, so if there are different kinds of goods and there are different kinds of heterogeneous shocks which are hitting individual goods, if some goods are traded and others are non-traded, then that may cause PPP not to hold. Okay, so we will look at that in more detail later on. Okay, now when you are testing PPP, what kind of price index should you use? Okay, so there's a lot of debate in the literature about which price index to use. So people use CPI, for example, but all commonly used measures of price level may have some non-traded goods in them, which may cause rejection of PPP. Or some conditions of homogeneity and proportionality that are required by PPP, which we will discuss later. Okay, so there are some researchers have tried to construct appropriate measures for testing PPP, because CPI is commonly available for many countries, but CPI is not the ideal measure for comparing purchasing power parity, for testing purchasing power parity, because it includes a large proportion of non-traded goods. So how should we construct the most appropriate price measure? And here Summers and Heston have done important work. So they developed a data set under the International Comparison Program, and basically they fix a common basket of goods for many countries. Okay? And so they make sure that the basket is identical across countries, and then they measure the prices of the goods in these baskets, and based on that they construct price level. Okay? So this may be an interesting approach, very precise, because you're controlling, making sure the basket is the same, the weights are the same, and so on. But the problem is it's very difficult, very expensive to construct and maintain such a data set. So in empirical work, it was not so useful because it was constructed at large time intervals, and data was not available for many countries. And then because they do the survey every few years, then in between there is no data, so they have to do some kind of interpolation or extrapolation to make data available. So that causes the prices to be artificial. They're not real prices. So then there is no really perfect way of solving this problem. So people still use price indices available from the national sources like CPI, GDP deflator, and so on, even though they have the index number limitations, which we have discussed before. Okay, so let's now look at some empirical evidence. First, for the law of one price. Okay? So law of one price, we said, is the building block of PPP. So what kind of empirical evidence do we have in support of law of one price? So in general, econometric studies suggest rejection of law of one price for a broad range of goods, and they provide strong evidence that deviations from law of one price are very volatile, and volatility of relative prices is considerably lower than the volatility of nominal exchange rates. Okay, so famous paper testing law of one price is by Isard. It's a classic in this literature, so you should read it. I'll quickly discuss this, and then, so how far can we push the law of one price? Okay, so what is Isard saying? Well, he's saying that when we study the theory of international trade, then typically the models that we have, there are a few goods, like one good, maybe there's two goods, right? You don't have millions of goods as in the real world, and each typically produced by several countries, but nevertheless the goods are homogeneous, right? Even though they are produced in different countries, they are basically identical. And then we assume zero transport costs, no trade barriers, commodity arbitrage is perfect, and so then you get the law of one price. Right? In theoretical models, that's how we think. Well, the real world is quite different, apparently. And so in reality, he's saying the law of one price is flagrantly and systematically violated in the data. Okay, so he shows evidence that exchange rate changes substantially alter the relative dollar equivalent prices of the most narrowly defined domestic and foreign manufactured goods for which prices can be matched. Okay, so there is deviation from law of one price. Not just that there is a deviation, but these deviations persist for several years. So they cannot be shrugged off as being temporary. You can't say, oh, there's a deviation, but in 6 months it will be corrected. Okay, the deviations last for a long time. Okay, so that's the paper. We're going to look at it in more detail. Okay, so to clarify discussion, he distinguishes between two contexts in which the law of one price is valid from a third context in which it is not valid. Okay, so first, in a comparison of well-defined things like steel items, CIF for delivery in a common port. So when we are comparing prices internationally, there are certain So CIF price means that the shipping cost, the insurance, and etc., these are included in the price. So price includes the shipping cost. Okay, but there are other kinds of prices free on board. So that means shipping cost is excluded. So that means the seller will deliver the goods to the ship, and once they are delivered to the ship, then the risk is transferred to the buyer from that point on. It is the buyer's job to pay the shipping costs and insurance, etc. Okay? So different kinds of prices, some include shipping, some do not include shipping. Okay, so in a related work, Rosenberg found that relative dollar prices charged by different countries were fairly constant over time and were not significantly affected by the exchange rate realignments. So that means law of one price is working well. Okay. Also, if you look at the dollar prices of primary commodities like oil, right, it's basically the same no matter which country you get it from, and so the price does not depend on the country of origin. There is a world price of oil, and all countries' oil prices will be very close to the world price because oil is oil, it's near perfect substitute. Oil from the Middle East or oil from Venezuela, oil from Iran, they're all the same thing. Okay? So any price disparities would be rapidly eliminated by commodity arbitrage. Now, so if goods are perfect substitutes, then we do find law of one price seems to hold. Okay, it's not a total disaster. Second, in the absence of restrictions on commodity arbitrage, a product of any single country sold competitively in two different markets would also obey the law of one price. Okay, so for example, iPhone produced by Apple, right? The price in Hong Kong should be the same as the price in the US if it is being sold competitively. Okay, otherwise, again, there would be an arbitrage opportunity. But what he is saying is that many manufactured goods do not have near perfect substitutes when you compare them with goods manufactured abroad. And it is in this context that the law of one price fails to hold. Okay? So if goods are near perfect substitutes, if markets are very competitive, then in those cases law of one price works. But where you cannot find near perfect substitutes, then law of one price fails. Okay? So for example, agricultural tilling machinery produced in the US is apparently not a close substitute for agricultural machinery produced in Germany. Right? Maybe the German one is better quality, so deserves a higher price. And so law of one price does not hold. Okay, we will continue our analysis of this. There's a couple of other